In 1995, the French anthropologist Marc Augier produced what was to become his defining text, Non-Places, an Introduction to Supermodernity, in which he posited the idea that our current temporal moment, or at least the time in which his text was produced, could be thought of as supermodernity. As the name suggests, supermodernity is an exaggerated version of the qualities of modernity and is defined by an accelerated loss of identity, an overabundance of information, and the shrinking of distances facilitated by the increased importance of the internet. 20 years before Augier's text, Edward Ralph had explored the loss of spatial identity that he described as placelessness. This is essentially a weakening of the identity of places to the point where they not only look alike, but feel alike and offer the same bland possibilities for experience. Ralph argues that placelessness occurs when places lose their authenticity through a variety of processes that include mass communications, mass culture, big business, powerful central authority, and the economic system which embraces all of these. So when we visit new towns and cities, we recognize many elements that are quite deliberately reproduced nationally. New homes and commercial buildings follow identical blueprints. And looking at the ever-increasing suburban outskirts, we see identical pockets of new builds popping up. Walking along any city street, we find the same configuration of Subway, Greggs and Costa, with interiors that are as uniform as possible from branch to branch. Once inside these repetitive spaces, their actual location becomes less important than the business identity itself. So we might momentarily forget that we're in Sheffield or Newcastle, but there's little doubt as to which business we're in. Unique and independent businesses are increasingly less prevalent, and the factors that make a city noteworthy are usually historical elements protected by heritage status, factors that can't be changed, basically. There are echoes of Ralph's placelessness in Augier's work, and in particular in his concept of the non-place. These, he asserted, are the spaces in which supermodernity finds its full expression. They're spaces which can't be defined as relational or historical or concerned with identity. Augier described non-places as being largely transient spaces that are usually entirely functional and do not encourage demonstrations of individuality and indeed foster a peculiar anonymity. Examples of non-places are supermarkets, hotel rooms and train stations. Within these non-places, we are required to confirm our identity through the use of a bank card, a room booking, or a travel ticket. Once our identity has been proven, we can then enjoy what Augier called the passive joys of identity loss. Our identities are then only required during a time of crisis, such as our card being rejected and so on. Train stations are, in terms of their function, transient spaces. They are spaces between destinations. As is the case with Ralph's concept of placelessness, the non-place is homogeneous and bland, and train stations certainly demonstrate high levels of sameness and a lack of unique identity. So stations largely fit into two categories: the Victorian station, retaining the design features particular to that period, or the modern station that more closely resembles the interior of a shopping centre. In both cases, but more particularly with the latter, we find the same chain businesses that we find in shopping centres, and the two spaces therefore become conflated. Were it not for the departure boards, we might believe we'd wandered into a mall. Within London's Underground Railway, the potential for sameness is vastly increased, given the subterranean nature of the system's location. Whilst the above-ground entrances may demonstrate some limited degrees of individuality, the platforms are incredibly uniform and devoid of identity. It's quite surprising how few examples of the Underground there are within horror cinema. Quatermass and the Pit use the fictional Hobbs End as the location for an excavated Martian craft that ironically calls into question our collective identity. An American werewolf in London used the location of Tottenham Court Road Station as one of a number of transient urban spaces that included the urban park and the waste ground, in which the titular werewolf is able to hunt and kill its victims. Deathline made great use of its Russell Square setting, and like Christopher Smith's Creep, the film explored the effects that such a space and non-place might have upon an individual spending their lives entirely within that space. Creep is, for the most part, set in the Charing Cross station and concerns a German woman called Kate trying to make her way to a party in another part of London where George Clooney is thought to be in attendance. She falls asleep on the platform and awakens to a locked and deserted station. The station's location beneath the streets of London is an immediately isolating factor. In pretty much any above-ground location, you would stand a good chance of finding some way out in the admittedly unlikely case of a lock-in. It's probable that Kate's falling asleep was assisted by the fact that she drank a bottle of vodka whilst waiting for the last train, albeit a small bottle. So Kate drinks this vodka whilst another passenger eats a kebab. But as neither of these activities are particularly encouraged within the space of the station, they're performed in a hurried and functional way. Auger suggests that a person entering the space of non-place is relieved of his usual determinants. He becomes no more than what he does or experiences in the role of passenger, customer, or driver. The activities of eating and drinking are outside of the remit of the passenger and so become bereft of any enjoyment or social value. And in fact, activities that might seem unremarkable in other proper places can become, in the non-place, even outrageous. Within stations, the tannoy voice reminds us that smoking is not permitted in any part of the station, whilst passengers are encouraged to report any behaviour that arouses suspicion, with the mantra, see it, say it, sorted. This is an understandable measure taken after the 2005 bomb attack that occurred between King's Cross St Pancras and Russell Square. But within a space that discourages expressions of identity, it's probable that behavioural expressions can seem exaggerated and even suspicious. An empty train arrives at the station, which is unusual because the station is closed, and the non-place is often governed by strict rules of use and an adherence to a timetable. Auger suggests that the link between individuals and their surroundings in the space of non-place is established through the mediation of words. And in a sense, any identity a station has is textual. In fact, the textual beacon of the departure board is the absolute focus of attention for those waiting to board their trains, almost in a behavioural stasis. There are no real markers of geographical identity, so the name of the station emblazoned onto its roundel is its only marker. But Kate boards this train regardless, presumably because the alternative is to spend the night in an empty station. Earlier at a party, Kate had rejected the advances of a cocaine dealer named Guy, and unbeknownst to her, he's followed her to the platform and boarded this empty train. So briefly, Guy attains scumbag status by attacking Kate, but is then himself attacked by an unseen assailant. Clearly, the isolated nature of the underground is a factor in Guy's behaviour, as is the fact that the non-place has very particular patterns of use. If the scheduled trains have finished their journeys, then there's absolutely no reason for anyone to be there. Therefore, Guy knows that his actions won't be witnessed or interrupted. As Kate continues to try and find a way out of the station, the only figure of authority she finds is a CCTV security supervisor manning the night watch. As Kate pleads for his help via the security camera, he says, "How do I know there aren't a gang of crackheads with you?" And she responds with, "Do I look like a crackhead to you?" throwing her arms out to draw attention to her clothing and to her general appearance. But she is in a non-place outside of the designated hours, and so any status she believes she has is entirely secondary to that fact. The security supervisor responds with, "It's hard to tell. I'm watching you on a black and white monitor in a long shot." So there's a distance and a lack of presence at play. The supervisor is viewing Kate's reduced and distorted image, and within the non-place, the individual is subject to Augier's passive joys of identity loss. As we place our individuality on hiatus within these spaces, we instead project a very subdued and mediated version of ourselves. The security supervisor's reluctance to assist Kate is partly due to the fact that the space of the underground is being used as a shelter by a homeless couple, Jimmy and Mandy, and so he's unsure whether she's simply part of this homeless crowd. When Kate encounters the couple, she asks Jimmy to show her where the security office is, but he tells her that they don't mess with him and he doesn't mess with them. Their presence within the station is tolerated, provided they remain anonymous figures, not drawing attention to themselves or making overt demonstrations of identity. Essentially, they're tolerated as long as they behave in similar ways to the passengers using the station. However, the fact that the section of the underground that Jimmy and Mandy occupy, a service hatch inside one of the walls, is lived in, makes it a more relational space than the platform. This is reminiscent of the ways in which the space of the underground was used during air raids in both World Wars. The people sheltering there were drawn to the space purely because of its advantageous location underground, but they recognised that spending significant periods of time within that space, devoid of relational or historical elements, could have detrimental effects upon their individual and group identities, and so measures were taken to personalise the spaces to enable a reinforcement of group identity. During World War II, some shelters had libraries, equipment for playing records, and some even produced newsletters. Clearly, these measures helped to maintain morale and encourage a group identity in opposition to the German forces dropping bombs on London. But these acts of personalisation were also an attempt to impose familiarity onto the space precisely because it's so bereft of relational identity. Kate eventually encounters the figure that attacked Guy. The assailant, Craig, is a male who seems to have either suffered from birth defects or received severe injuries at some point in his life, meaning he lacks any particularly identifiable features. It's therefore difficult to define his age or any particular details about his appearance. Craig has apparently lived his entire life within a clandestine and now defunct experimental medical facility, the purpose of which was to conduct experiments upon children. The facility is housed close to the underground and adjacent to a sewerage system, and there are some parallels between the sewerage system and the underground railway. Clearly, a system of pipes that carries away the body's waste materials needs to be kept at some distance for the purpose of hygiene. Similarly, London's transport system has a history of being kept at some distance from ideas of civility. Prior to the advent of the railway, the de rigueur form of transport was the horse-drawn carriage, or for the general public, the horse-drawn omnibus. Given the widespread use of horses as a means of pulling public vehicles and as a means of private transport, it was inevitable that a great deal of dung was produced, which would be collated in dung heaps in the poorest areas of London, with no regard for the citizens without the financial resources to live elsewhere. So the mechanics of the transport system have always been viewed as an undesirable element. The decision to locate London's new railway underground was also informed by a desire to separate out the functional from the formal. In his History of the London Underground, Christian Vollmer discusses how soaring land values and the vested interests of the major estate owners made surface developments in the centre of London prohibitively expensive and prompted a plethora of schemes for creating railways underneath and through London. So there was, from the outset, a desire to keep the perceived base functionality of the railway out of sight, and especially out of sight of the more wealthy parts of the city. At the start of the film, we see two sewerage workers performing a routine tunnel check and finding a blocked inlet pipe. The blockage is described as being the result of shit, tampons, condoms, pretty much anything that will fit down a toilet. These are the things that people want to forget about because they symbolize bodily functions, things that are expelled in order for the body to work correctly. Because the sewerage system is essentially the city's colonic tract, and the underground was from its outset viewed as a dualistically functionally vital, yet abjectly undesirable space, the medical facility's placement within proximity of both of these systems enables it to remain undetected. Because of this proximity to the abject space of the sewage system and the non-space of the Underground Railway, the medical facility is not relational or concerned with identity. Inevitably, then, Craig has had no opportunity to form any relational bonds outside of his very narrow experience of space. In a sense, Craig is in a suspended infantile stasis, and as is the case with a young child, his behaviour seems to be largely imitative. Craig's tendency towards the mimetic is shown in a horrific scene in which he's abducted the homeless woman Mandy and strapped her to a birthing table. He goes through the mime of washing his hands underneath the tap that stopped working some time ago, even turning the tap off with his elbow, as he must surely have seen a surgeon doing. He puts on a surgical robe and a pair of filthy latex gloves before picking up a saw and performing a procedure upon Mandy that is left to the imagination. Throughout the film, Craig emits high-pitched squeals, and as he is followed wherever he goes by a pack of rats, it's possible that he's simply imitating the noises that they produce. We see Craig cutting some flesh from one of his captured victims and throwing it into a rat-filled pit, and we can assume that as he doesn't have access to a source of food within the facility, that he is like the rats, consuming raw flesh. Like these rats, Craig merely survives as he flits between the facility, the sewerage system, and the underground hunting for food. Kate is initially held captive by Craig, but she manages to escape along with one of the sewerage workers from the beginning of the film. And as they overpower Craig and are about to kill him, he repeats Mandy's final words, "Please don't hurt me, I'll do anything you want." This initially placates Kate, but it's only when he repeatedly says Mandy's final word, "Jimmy," that she realizes that he's simply mimicking her dying pleas. Having no speech of his own, Craig doesn't recognize the meaning or significance of Jimmy's name, and he's simply repeating what he recognizes as a plea in order to save himself. So in summary, non-places are an increasingly prevalent element of most of our lives, and the fact that they're entirely functional and usually in service to capital means that when we use these spaces, we're passive consumers, not involved in investing these spaces with meaning. If, as Auger suggests, these spaces are unconcerned with identity, then what effect might such spaces have upon the identities of people spending increased amounts of time within them? It's in this sense that Craig is an embodiment of those effects. His appearance is almost barely constructed, as though his features are subdued and faded. His actions are purely functional and centered upon merely existing, whilst his utterances are entirely mimetic, reflecting his lack of identity. It's almost tempting to conclude that non-places can only ever produce non-people.